Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, the creator and host of the award-winning podcast that you're listening to right now. Thank you so much, called Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. It is a daily podcast, 365 days a year, and each day we talk to an author about all of the things related to their career, their book, their life, and more in 30 minutes or less, because who has time? I am now an author myself, although I wasn't when I started this podcast, and you can get my new memoir, Bookends, a memoir of love, loss, and literature, wherever books are sold starting July 1st, and my children's book, Princess Charming. You can learn more about me at zibbyowens.com, but really you're here to learn more about the authors, and that is what we're going to do. Also, be sure to check out all the other podcasts in the Zcast Podcast Network. You can learn more at zcastnetwork.com and definitely check out those shows as well. Julia Glass is the author of Vigil Harbor, a novel. Julia is the author of 6 previous books of fiction, including the bestselling 3 Junes, winner of the National Book Award, and I See You Everywhere, winner of the Binghamton University John Gardner Fiction Book Award. Other published works include the Kindle single Chairs in the Rafters and essays in several anthologies. A recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, Glass is a distinguished writer in residence at Emerson College. She lives with her family in Marblehead, Massachusetts. Welcome, Julia. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books.
Thank you, Zibby.
I have to tell you, I'm sure you don't remember this, but about, 20 years ago or something. When did 3 Junes come out?
20 years ago this past May.
So I was right. So I went to an event in Brooklyn at someone's house and you were there. There were like 2 or 3 tables and I sat at your table and I'm like the biggest fan of 3 Junes ever. And it was me and all these moms and I did not have kids then. And the whole time everyone was talking about schools and this and that. I was like, I don't even understand what everyone's talking about. I just want to talk about the book.
So that must have been at my agent Gail Hockman's house in Park Slope. I'm thinking that's when it was. Wow. Well, you have a good memory. I sort of remember that dinner, but you're right. If there are moms, what do we talk about? We don't talk about books. I mean, we do, but we got to get the mom stuff up first.
No. Now that I am a mom, I understand, because I remember telling my mom and she laughed and she's like, oh, just you wait.
I heard your show with Anthony Dorr and how you guys were talking about being parents of twins.
Yeah. You don't have twins though, right?
No. I have 2 boys 5 years apart, not boys anymore, but yeah.
5 years is a good split, don't you think? What do you?
It's how far apart I was from my sister. It's a little farther than I might have liked, but Mother Nature will have her way. So
yes, I have a 6-year gap, so I understand. But anyway, okay, Vigil Harbor. I watched your interview with the Boston Public Library, which was really fascinating. And one of the things you said was how it was one character from another book. And this is the continuation that the character had landed in Vigil Harbor, and that's where you started this and the launching off point. So tell listeners what Vigil Harbor is about, how you decided to bring that particular loop in to start off, and everything else.
Well, first of all, every single one of my books starts with a single character who comes to me. And it may be from a previous book, whether I like it or not. And it actually, in this case, there were sort of 2 characters. But one, for the one you're referring to, is Celestino, who's a character, very important character in my novel, The Widower's Tale. And in that book, he's an undocumented Guatemalan lawn worker who aspires to have his own tree business. And that novel ends in a town I invented called Vigil Harbor, which is a seaside town in Massachusetts based on the town that I live in, which is called Marblehead. And, you live in a coastal community, so the privileges and the, hazards of what it's like to live by the sea. And so I kept thinking about Celestino through another couple of books, and I wanted to bring him back, but I was also visited by this architect. And sometimes when I'm writing a book, I become fascinated by a particular profession. And I think, I really want to write about an oncologist. I really want to write about a concert cellist. And I'll delve into that. So in my town here, there are a lot of architects. And it's also a town with a lot of historical architecture. And, I'm surrounded by houses built even the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. And I'm fascinated by fantasizing about all the lives that have been lived in these old houses. And I think it draws in a lot of architects as well. So I had this idea about an architect who's in the prime of his profession, who builds houses to withstand the increasingly furious coastal storms we have, as Florida is being battered by Ian. And everything has gone well for him, but there's a secret from his past. When he was a young architect in New York City, he had a very tempestuous affair with a young woman, very artistic, intense young woman who presented herself as a creature from the deep, as it were. And I thought, am I really going to go there? Is Julia Glass the hyper-realist writer about families and communities and heartbreak and, going to bring something supernatural in? And I thought, maybe she claims to be a mermaid or a Selkie. I wasn't even sure. But I thought, so he works in this privileged, beautiful, historic town on the Massachusetts coast, and the stranger comes to town. The woman from his past, another woman from his past who he isn't aware knew of him, who was also in love with this young woman, Isa. The relationship came to a very tragic end. So it was to be, on the one hand, I really wanted this character Celestino to be, for the reader to see him decades later, settled in this seaside town, married with a child, and a successful business. And he works with that architect. And people are thinking, what is, this is me, what happens inside my head is that characters constellate. I'm utterly incapable of writing a novel from one point of view.
That was a beautiful sentence, by the way. That should be on a t-shirt. Where characters constellate.
Okay, well,
that's really cool.
Make the t-shirt, Zibby, and I'll buy a dozen.
Okay, I'll make it.
So I had these sort of two poles, this architect with this secret that's going to emerge from his past, because this woman who's sort of bent on vengeance, but also wants to find out what became of Isa, this passionate young woman who presented herself as this otherworldly creature. And this man who has this very successful business as an arborist. By the way, I'm obsessed with trees. Drive me down a street and I'm going to say, what's that tree? What's that tree? I just planted a Tupelo tree in my yard. And I go out and watch it like a baby. Maybe it's, my displaced motherhood here now that I'm an empty nester. But anyway, but something different happened to me with this novel. And I think it's because I actually became very intimidated by the notion that I was going to try to work in a fantastical element into my novel. And that is that I stepped aside from that novel and I wrote another novel, which was A House Among the Trees, my last book. And I don't do that. It felt like I was having an affair. Like I left my spouse, like I packed my bags and, run off to Spain with this other novel. So when after A House Among the Trees was published in 2017, I kind of went slinking back toward the 75 pages gathering dust on my desktop, where Celestino and this architect Austin and Isa, this woman, and Petra, the stranger who comes to town and outs the secret, there they lurked, and I, as I joke in my author's note to Vigil Harbor, we went into marriage counseling and I salvaged the marriage because I'm a stubborn person and asked my husband. But what had happened is it was 2017 and our world had changed a lot in the 3 or 4 years since I had left those characters behind. I'll just sort of tell you the story that you maybe heard in that interview. I had to go back and do a little Googling, but this was June 1st of 2017. I was actually pulling into my garden center to buy a tree, as a matter of fact. And NPR was on, and everyone was waiting for our relatively new president to come on the radio. And everyone knew what he was going to say. And I thought, no, he's not going to say that because nobody would say that. And I waited in the parking lot and listened. And yes, our president pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord. And personally, I feel that climate change, I'm hardly the only one, is the most urgent of so many challenges facing us. And I sat in the parking lot and I cried. I mean, I just thought, do these people have children? Do they have grandchildren? What is going on here? And I thought to myself, what is it like at this moment in time to be a climate scientist or a climate change activist and to feel that everything, all the work you've done is just, roadkill? And I thought, what if we reach a time when, in order to be heard, those people resort to violence, to terrorism? And suddenly I thought, here I'm writing a novel about this coastal community, which is privileged. I will tell you, and I borrowed this line for one of my characters. My husband jokes about our town that diversity is represented by brunettes. And that's about true. I mean, it's a politically mostly very liberal town, but, be that as it may. So what if I set this novel a dozen years in the future when all those big issues that keep us up at night, immigration and reproductive rights, but climate change, certainly, that the volume has been raised on those issues. Things are more dire. Politics is more polarized. There's actually in my novel a splinter political party called the End Timers. But I did not want to write a dystopian novel. First of all, dystopia is above my pay grade. My imagination is not very good on technology, for instance. So my joke about this, I was actually emailing the writer Karen Russell, whose imagination is just out where the buses don't run. And I think she's so brilliant. And I said, guess what? I'm writing something that's set in the future. I said, it's baby steps speculative. So what happened is I now knew the larger world, the more dire world in which my privileged community was this kind of bubble, in which the people believe in some ways they're insulated from the rising seas because, for instance, this town, like my own town, is set up on a sort of granite pedestal. It's not like towns on Cape Cod and the mid-Atlantic coast where, almost daily you can see the coast eroding and houses going underwater, even regardless of hurricanes. So I kind of knew when and where this novel was set. And then the characters began to gather. And one of the most important characters, and this actually surprised me, I write forward into the dark. I do not plot a novel. So sometimes characters that I thought were incidental become very important. And one of those characters is the architect Austen's stepson, whose name is Brecht. And his is essentially the first voice you hear in the novel. And he's in his early 20s. He was in New York City for college, and something very violent happened. He survived a very traumatic event. And so he came home to Vigil Harbor.
That was in Union Square, right?
Yes. And there's a bombing in Union Square, where when I lived in New York City, I went to the farmer's market three times a week. So Brecht is someone who's been traumatized, and his life is on hold as he tries to figure out where he's going. And he lives in his father's house with his mother, his stepfather, Austen. And he works for Celestino. He works building walls. He works planting trees. And his view of the world in which he lives as a 20-something was really the greatest leap of imagination for me. There's also new language because, of course, do you have teenagers yet?
I do. I have two 15-year-olds.
You come home and use these adjectives, and you're like, that's not how that word is used,
right? Especially
if you're a word monger, and you realize this is the language evolving. So I had some fun with Brecht's, new twists of phrase and so on. But in addition to Brecht, who becomes in a way not the heart of the novel, but he's seeing the world through his eyes, is where I really encountered this near future, most directly. Most of the other characters are older, and I had a little fun with, so Vigil Harbor has a yacht club that is for people very much a social center. And if I tell you that my town has 5 yacht clubs, now imagine if I'd tried that, nobody would believe that a town has 5 yacht clubs. And Zibby, I love visiting book groups, and I visit book groups here. And the first question is, which club is it? And of course, I say, it's a composite. So anyway, another pair of characters that I really enjoyed writing were Mike, who's, Mike and Margot are these 2 characters, both in their 50s. They've raised their children. They belong to the yacht club. And to their mortification and shock, their spouses leave them for each other and run away to a survivalist community in Wisconsin, because there's this whole survivalist movement, as you can imagine. I guess they're called preppers, but I didn't use that term. And so Mike, who's this very serious marine biologist, and Margot, who's this spitfire of a retired high school English teacher, are thrown together, not romantically, but sort of by virtue of being cast in this town scandal. And Margot has taught Brecht. So there are all these connections among the characters. And Mike's grown son, Egon, who's an actor in New York City, comes home because there's another bombing in New York City. And
you're making me feel a little uneasy sitting here talking to you in New York City.
I'm giving your listeners vertigo, because So if I tell you that the novel is narrated by 8 characters, 7 of those characters are people who live in Vigil Harbor. Perhaps they've lived there their whole lives or they've come there. And then there's this stranger. There's also another stranger who comes to town who's actually another character from a previous novel. But I'm not going to go into that subplot. The events of the novel take place over only a few days, bringing these characters together in an event that is quite a violent event. I mean, an event that brings the dangers of the outer world into this bubble of a town and throws everyone together. But also, like all of my books, each character is this deep well of experience. And, I call myself the flashback queen because, by the time you finish one of my novels, each of my characters all the way back to their childhood. Their gene pool, their struggles to become who they are in whatever profession they're in. So for readers of mine who were a little terrified at the thought that I'd, turned into a sci-fi writer, that isn't the case at all. I'm still really writing about how do we endure? I think all the greatest fiction is about how there's this amazing yin yang in human nature of fragility and resilience. And also, I've said this very often, but one of the things that really interests me in fiction is what happens when, because we know it happens frequently, what happens when people who are fundamentally good-hearted and very smart make incredibly foolish choices in their lives. And how do they deal with the consequences of that? How do they deal with the fallout? Can they rise above it? Can they get through it? So once again, I am writing about a group of characters who are, confronted with intimate challenges and losses, and also global issues that are affecting their lives every day, whether they like it or not. And like all of my novels, I believe that this book ends hopefully. One bookstore where I did an event said, Julia Glass's amazing and devastating new novel. And I thought, well, thank you for saying it's amazing, but I don't think it's devastating. I mean, it's not the kind of novel that allows you to set aside from your mind the worries we all share as a nation, as families, as towns. But maybe it allows you to immerse yourself in them in a different way and to see that we will all work our way through these things. I mean, this is not a fairy tale. Everybody doesn't have a happy ending, but this is very much asking myself, how do we get through this? How will we? How could we? I mean, my imagination of the world 12 years from now, because the year that this takes place in is 2034. And by the way, I've been asked by a couple of readers if I chose that because it's 50 years after 1984. And no, I mean, I am so not a numbers person. I mean, I could now claim, oh, yes, of course, it's echoes of George Orwell, but it's not an Orwellian novel. So no. And in fact, there's another novel that came out last fall that I really was riveted by and admired enormously called 2034, and that's the title, that imagines that that's the year in which World War III begins. And I thought, well, if that were actually the case in 2034, my characters would have a lot more to worry about than what they're worrying about.
Wasn't that Elliot Ackerman's book?
Yes, it is.
Oh my gosh, I love him. He's
have you interviewed him?
I have interviewed him, and his
incredible.
Partner Lee Carpenter is an old friend of mine from business school. She was the very first guest on this podcast, and that's when I realized I loved podcasting was because of Lee. And so I see Lee and Elliot quite a bit, although not less. But anyway, yes, 2034.
So I also, because I've talked about all the points of view in this book, and I promise you won't get confused. I promise I steer you straight through all of these different narrators, but I have to have a little mom brag moment here, Zibby. So
always.
Most of my previous books have been narrated by single audio readers. And audiobooks, though, I can't listen to an audiobook because my mind wanders. It's a terrible confession. I have to read. So, but I have so many friends who that's how they get books. They listen to them. And I am, have come to realize over the past 20 years that the audiobook is incredibly and increasingly important. So imagine my shock when the producer told me that they were going to cast 9 performers for this audiobook, because in addition to the 8 narrators, there's kind of an omniscient overview that I use, sort of that punctuates these voices, that kind of gives you a picture of the sort of long history of this town, Vigil Harbor. And so, I had the pleasure of being able to ask, for them to cast a friend of mine who's an actor named Jeremy Davidson, who does audiobooks as well as stage and screen acting. And he reads Mike, the marine biologist, who's for me a really beloved character. Some people think he's the character who's the most like me. My friends love reading my books and saying, "This is you, Julie," even though aspects of me are in all of my characters. But at my 25-year-old son, who had graduated from college in performance and theater, although the pandemic sent him in another direction and he is now a farmer, I really heard his voice. He has a beautiful voice as Egon, who is Mike's son, the actor who comes back from New York.
Oh, so it's actually your son.
Well,
narrating.
so
That's
get this,
amazing.
I say to the producer over the phone, I say, "No, you're going to roll your eyes, but I have this son." And she just interrupted me and said, "Anyone can send me a tape and try out." And it took him 2 tapes with her. She gave him notes. And my son, Alec, is one of the voices. And it just, it really, did it bring us closer? No, but did it make him go and read all my books? No. So, I had a funny experience where his college roommate who came to us for Thanksgiving asked, I was at the breakfast table with his roommate one morning and my son, I think, was still sleeping. And he said, "So I understand you're an author." And I said, "Yes." And, he said all the nice things you'd say. He said, "But so it's interesting to me that Alec hasn't read any of your books." And I said, "Yeah, that's interesting to me too, because he's a really big reader and he's an actor and he's, been in like 6 Shakespeare plays." And he said, "Well, yeah, he told me why it is." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because he's terrified that there may be sex scenes, and the idea that he might read a sex scene written by his mother is just," and I said, "You know what? That's a very good reason not to read your mother's books." So.
Yeah.
Not that my books are very racy.
No. I had originally written some more steamy scenes in my memoir about my own husband and I was like, I have to take these out. My kids are going to read this one day. I can't share.
Well, the other thing is I've still got a living mother who reads. So, that's the other thing. You don't want your mother reading.
That's true. That's true. Although I have to say, that's what people want to read. Like a lot of people want to read, have a little bit of that in their.
Well, not in all cases, but in most cases, when I write about intimacy, there's, it's like the rock and roll fade out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So.
We're watching Tembi Locke, her book From Scratch. It was just made into a show on Netflix.
Oh, wow.
I was lucky enough to get the screener because I'm interviewing her. Anyway, I'm watching with my kids and they're loving it because it's in Florence and it's beautiful and cooking and whatever. And then all of a sudden there keep being these scenes. And so I keep jumping on top of them on the couch. And like, no, here comes another one. And I just lunge. Anyway, it's probably not a good parenting moment, but anyway. It's lovely what we do for our kids.
Right.
Well, first of all, you are just a genius. You're like a creative. Listening to you describe how your mind works and how you craft stories and create characters and interlink them and plots and how you take the things that are bothering you and that you want people to examine and then twist it around and put it into a story, because really that's how people feel enough to make changes in their own life, right? They can't, I feel like if you read 100 articles about climate change, you can put them off into one analytic piece of your brain. If you hear one story about one family affected truly by climate change, it might make more of a difference, right? Your ability to tie all that in and really affect people and the world, that's the goal, right? It's to get people to re-examine. We're all making decisions every day, whether we think we are or not.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. And during the writing of this book, I subscribed to the New York Times climate newsletter. So I'd get those in my inbox. And I have to say, sometimes I'd think, God, this, I'd start out the day and go, oh, here it is. And I'd read. But you know what? You read really hopeful things too. And I have to say, and I want to say that especially for parents who have older kids and you wonder, how can they want to go forward and make a family? I mean, I have a 26-year-old in a committed relationship, and I don't go there with my kids. But Ezra Klein in the New York Times wrote this beautiful piece called "Your Kids Are Not Doomed." And I recommend that op-ed piece to any parent in particular who has older children and wonders, how do you talk about the future? How do you feel hopeful? But there is much to be hopeful about. There really is. And I hope that my book is a part of that conversation. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I know my son, I talked to him about some of this the other day, and there was a whole group of us, and he was like, oh yeah, no, we're all like totally screwed for life, basically. Like there's no hope for us. And I'm like, really? Do you feel that way? Because I don't know that that's necessary. And he's like, no, that's what all my friends, like, that's what they all think.
That's what this addresses. Also, when I had those conversations with my older son, sometimes he's like, and it's your generation that did this to us. And, mine, I mean, I'm older than you, Zibby, but, we're a very, very privileged and fortunate generation of Americans. My generation escaped by a few years being drafted for the Vietnam War. Personally, I feel that the war that I was witness to, because I was very close to it and I did volunteer work, is the AIDS epidemic in New York City.
Yep.
I was right square in the middle of that, but I wasn't personally affected by it. But no, he's right. I mean, I cannot argue with him that the excesses in which my generation that we perpetrated are very real. But of course, my generation is still around to try to help amend that. And his generation, the ingenuity, not just the resilience, but the ingenuity of human beings is incredible. And, I see that our time is drawing to a close, but I want to say that I'll just tell you one little story here. While I was sort of getting ready for this book to come out, and I was in this kind of nervous state, I was looking around my bookcase one day, and I saw this book I picked up at a cash register, and it's called The World According to Fred Rogers. So in a way, we go back to children. And, it's these gems that Mr. Rogers said over his lifetime. And I opened it up to one, and he said, parents sometimes ask me when something catastrophic is happening and their children see that catastrophe, whether it's on TV, whether it's a hurricane or terrorist bombing. And I was there with a 5-year-old in New York City, 9/11. He said, what you say to the children is look for the fixers. Wherever you see catastrophe, whether it's the Red Cross, whether it's FEMA, whether it's Anthony Fauci on TV, there are always people whose whole heart and whole life, is dedicated to fixing, to getting around, getting through, enduring that. And I thought, maybe that sounds simple, but it's not. And that's where that's where I want to draw the attention in my book and, in my parenting. There are always people working as hard as they possibly can to make things better. And I like to think fiction writers are among those people.
I think so too. Julia, this was so great. I could listen to you all day. You're such a masterful storyteller. Seriously,
thank you so much.
To listen to you is a privilege. So thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you. I had a great time.
Good. Me too.
All right. Good luck with the rest of your tour.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.